Okay, thank you so much for tuning in. And Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. We are talking on behalf of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So I brought in Jason from the Starkloff Disability Institute to talk to us a little bit more about accommodations, disclosure, transitioning into the workforce. Jason, as it turns out, you and I both we started our current jobs about the same time.
Yeah.
So both been doing this for about 4 years now. So definitely experts, right?
Right, yeah.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, Jason, why don't you tell me more about yourself and the Starkloff Disability Institute?
Okay. Well, I'll start with Starkloff. We're the Workplace Disability Advisors, and our mission is to make a more inclusive world for people with disabilities. It's a very broad mission, but a good nonprofit has a good broad goal. We've been around since 2003. Our adult services program that I work on has been around since 2012, and I've been here since 2016. Starkloff pursues our mission by working on empowering people with disabilities to reach their employment goals. We also try to empower companies to be more welcoming to people with disabilities through consultation, training. We're doing a lot of online resources. We have programs for high school students, current college students, and college graduates. We have a one-on-one career consultation that's completely free to people with disabilities, and we have a 10-week course that we do twice a year. We have partnerships with about 50 different companies in St. Louis, ranging from smaller shops like Spectrum Healthcare Resources to the big ones like Centene Corporation and Nestle Purina. And we've got about an 85% success rate of helping people with disabilities find employment. So we're very proud of what we do. I am actually a graduate of the Adult Services program. I took it back in 2013. You won't know it from looking at me. I am legally blind, which means visual acuity is 2200. I have no depth perception. I can't drive, and the world is safer for it. I've been visually impaired since birth, and it's been difficult. Not being able to drive. I moved to St. Louis from Arkansas because you can't get a job in Arkansas if you can't drive. I went to grad school to become a social worker, and I left social work, and come to find out you can't get an entry-level job in social work if you can't drive. So I needed help, and I did not know thing one about how to get a job. I was one of many just sitting there shooting resumes out on Monster. I found out about the Starkloff course, took it. Is definitely the first course that I'd ever taken that was specifically for professionals with disabilities. There's nothing generic about it. It's everything you ever need to know. We set the goal of it being like a college level course. We're comparing it to classes, business school classes at like SLU or UMSL or some of these other places, and we've been really successful. I got a job within 6 months. I've been a crisis worker, I've been a low vision therapist, and when the opportunity came to take a job at Starkloff, which I'd been volunteering with pretty regularly, I took it. I am our adult career services coordinator. So if you're out of college or a company or a community partner, you're going to be working with me.
Excellent. Thank you so much again. And thank you for coming through on such short notice. I should also put that plug in as well.
No problem.
Woo, really bailed me out on that one. All right. So what advice do you have for students with disabilities that are transitioning to full-time employment?
Really use the resources at your disposal now. I mean, you've got your career centers, you've got LinkedIn is like the #1 thing you could be using. We are big fans at Starkloff, what we call like Big D disability. It's a social identity. We're really into that social model. We talk about owning your disability with pride. The thing is, the reason why disability discrimination occurs, 9 times out of 10, it's from ignorance. We don't get healthy messages about disability in our culture, in our society. And so when able-bodied folks interact with disability, often it's the first time that they're doing it. So if you as a person with a disability are treating your disability like it's something to be ashamed of, they're going to pick up on that and they're going to reinforce that message in their heads. If you act like it's something to be proud of, then they're going to be less concerned with asking you questions. They don't know what they don't know, and they need your permission to ask those tough questions that they have. The final piece of advice I would say is 75–80% of what you should be doing in your job search time is networking. So there's that adage, you know, job searching is a full-time job. Well, I work a full-time job, it's about 40 hours a week. If I'm job searching, then like 4.5 of those 5 days is going to be setting up informational interviews, trying to connect with people on LinkedIn, looking for companies and having those interviews with people. I'm not even going to get on a job board until I know someone at a company that I want to work for. That's what I feel is the gold standard for a job search. And especially the more barriers you have, disability, race, gender expression, age, the more barriers you have, the more important your networking is. You need allies on your side. Your allies are going to be your greatest asset when you're job searching. It's going to, you know, sad but true, Martin Luther King Jr. was a great leader, but it took Lyndon Johnson, a white male, to sign the Civil Rights Act. That's just, we're always looking for allies in this community. You should always be looking for allies too.
Yeah, wow, it's powerful. Well, and we do know that 70–85% of jobs are obtained through networking, period. So yeah, I think that I like the way that translates to how much of your time you should be spending on networking too. It makes a lot of sense. When should candidates disclose their disabilities, and how do you recommend they go about doing that?
So I always start the conversation by saying that's personal preference. You know, when you're talking to an employer about a reasonable accommodation, it's basically you're entering into a negotiation wherein you reveal some of your personal medical information in order to get what you have a right to receive to do your job. So if you don't want to, well, I get the long and short of it is the employer needs to know what they need to know. We actually have a flow chart we go through with our candidates, and it basically works like this. First and foremost, is your disability visible and obvious? The law says that even if you don't tell them that you're in a wheelchair, the fact that you're in the office with a wheelchair means the employer is automatically required to get you in a reasonable accommodation, even if you don't request it. I would also say we've had plenty of recruiters tell us that the fact of the matter is they're expecting an able-bodied person to walk through that door. And when it's a person with a disability, they're a little caught off guard. There's a lot of rules and laws and regulations about disability. So if they know what to expect beforehand, it's better for them. And the best way you might do that is you've been offered the interview, you're in the scheduling period. Oh, by the way, I'm a wheelchair user. Can you tell me where the accessible entrance is? Or are you going to be doing any kind of computer test for this job? I'm visually impaired and we might need some accommodations. A disclosure like that is going to really help them understand what to expect when you come through the door. Now, 75% of disabilities are invisible. The leading cause of disability in this country is actually mental illness. So then it comes down to, all right, do you need an accommodation for the interview? You don't need to worry about accommodations for the job yet because it's incremental steps, right? You're only getting an accommodation for the job interview. If you don't need one and you don't have an immediately visible and obvious disability, you don't need to bring it up. But we also like to talk about, tell them your why. You know, the first thing we're going to do with somebody is, why do you want this job? Well, it's because I'm interested in it. Why are you interested in it? When someone tells me that they're interested in a job because it relates to their personal experience with disability, I tell them to find an opportunity to bring that up. You know, your disability is never the reason you're going to get a job. It's never your primary selling point, but it's the icing on the cake. It's that little extra thing that tells them, look, I'm going to be better than this at this job than someone without this disability because it's relevant to the job. If you can't see how it's relevant to the job, you don't need an accommodation, and you're really worried about too much personal information, you don't have to tell them anything. But I will end with this. You know, you're going to spend a third of your life in your workplace, and it's really hard to be in the workplace and not get to be your genuine self. We already have to wear enough masks. If it's for your comfort to be out and proud, as it were, about your disability, then look for companies where you can do that. There are all kinds of resources. There's the Disability Equality Index. There's the National Organization on Disability. There's Lyme Connect. All these different organizations are getting thousands and thousands of dollars from these companies that they list on their websites. Starkloff has got 48 of them. Look for those companies and make those your target when you're job searching, and you can feel more confident that you will be safely able to disclose without much pushback.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that information, because I'm sure those are things that our students have not necessarily heard or even had to think about yet. So you mentioned reasonable accommodations. What qualifies as reasonable accommodations? I know that's a huge, probably too much to cover in one answer, but and what is the best way to go about requesting those?
So it's actually easier to answer the question, what is an undue hardship? If you look at the language of the ADA, a reasonable accommodation is an accommodation that doesn't impose an undue hardship. An undue hardship is basically, it's too expensive or it's too outside the wheelhouse for the company to reasonably expect to meet that need. Taking an example from my life, you know, a lot of entry-level social work jobs are case management jobs. All right, well, I could sit there and say, well, you can hire a driver for me. Well, how much does it actually cost to pay a driver? You know, you're budgeted for one person's job plus reimbursement for mileage. That's not the same as paying a driver. They can't afford to pay two people to do one person's job. It's also not reasonable because a lot of case managers are responsible for transporting clients who can't transport themselves. You start bringing in a third party and you run into HIPAA concerns. So when you consider those things, then yeah, it doesn't actually make much sense for the employer to hire another person when they've also hired me. Now, a middle ground might be working with a coworker, or it might be utilizing Uber. If a client needs to get to an interview, can I get them an Uber and then meet them at the interview? Because I don't need to be responsible for transporting them to the interview. I just need to be responsible for prepping them for the interview. That's a more reasonable accommodation. It's not as expensive to hire an Uber or Lyft driver as it is to hire a driver to basically sit in the office with me until I have an in-person appointment. How you request an accommodation is you always want to do it as formally as possible. Have it written down. Go through the official channels, your HR office or your supervisor. You want a paper trail because you might occasionally run into a coworker who says, well, I don't understand why this is important, or I feel like you're getting special treatment. Or you get a new manager who's saying, well, I don't understand why you're doing this. That paper trail will ensure that when you go to HR, that it gets done. If you have an informal accommodation set up with your supervisor, you're really setting yourself up for a big fight down the line when you get a new supervisor or a new coworker who doesn't understand why you have that. Some things to understand with accommodations, I always just make sure it's really important to understand, A, it's a negotiation. So your first request is not always going to be what they meet. So keep your mind open, be willing to try new things. The second thing, obviously get it documented. The third thing is to understand that you know more about what you need than they do. I've seen some ridiculous efforts on the part of companies to try and meet someone's needs without actually asking them what they needed. So please have a plan in your head when you're making an accommodation of what you would benefit from, and let them understand that it might change. If your disability changes, if your job duties change, if the first accommodation doesn't work out, leave that open and never be afraid to go and say, hey, this didn't work. Can we try something new? Because it's not them being nice to you that they give you accommodations. It's them following the law to give you accommodations. And they want to do that. Employers are very careful about making sure that you're staying productive and they're being legally compliant. Because even if 95% of discrimination cases are won by the company, it's a lot of money to win a discrimination case. They would much rather just follow the law.
Great. So I think an interesting way to look at it, or way I've come to look at it, is that these students, a lot of our students at SLU are traditional students. They've been in school their whole life, and they have, figured out how to request accommodations throughout school, right? For testing and that kind of stuff. And then we get in the real world, and I don't know about you, but I haven't had to have a lot of exams.
Right.
So like even rethinking some of those accommodations is important. And I kind of like what you're saying, think ahead and really reflect on that kind of thing. So
well, if I can give a plug real quick, one of our programs, Access U, it's specifically devoted to helping college students with disabilities get internships. I think the more work experience, quote unquote, safe work experience you can get in college, the better an idea you'll have of the accommodations you need. It's really hard to get fired from being an intern. So look for those.
Some people actually get hired for being interns. So
yeah, there's a lot of advantages to interns, volunteering, whatever as close to real world experience as you can get. Because the other thing about school accommodations is they tend to be pretty cut and dry. Your job accommodations are going to be specific to your needs, the resources of the company, and the needs of the job. They're not going to have a list of stuff to go through. So you're going to have to be the one to guide them through the process.
Right. Awesome. So final question, what are your top 3 tips for success in a job search?
You need to know what you're looking for. 1, look, you're coming out of school. The first thing employers want to know, do you actually know what it means to have a job? Because believe it or not, a lot of younger folks these days are just walking out of work because they decide they don't like it, and they're setting themselves up for failure down the line. So that first job is probably not going to be your dream job. In fact, most people don't work their dream job, but they're on a path to something. If you've got to start out being the mail clerk so that you can become the HR rep down the line, that's part of your path. Be open to that, but have a long-term goal. Constantly be networking. Informational interviews are your best friend. Really, I'm going to say it as many times as I can. 75–80% of your time needs to be networking, because not only will they prove useful in the future, but they'll also tell you how you reach your long-term goal. Great interview questions. This is my long-term goal. What kinds of jobs should I be looking for? What skills do I need to be successful? Where could I look for internship opportunities? What do you like to see in a resume? Stuff like that is going to be really helpful to you. And use all of the resources. Don't fall into the Indeed monster trap. Those are okay, but man, it's like shooting your resume out into the void. It's so ineffective that you're just going to burn yourself out. LinkedIn is your best friend. Your career centers are your best friend. Diane's been doing this as long as I have, and we're both pretty good at our jobs. So use those resources and supplement them with other resources. Diane is being honest with me and saying, like, look, we know how to get a job. We're not experienced with disability. Then call me. Diane and I will be on the same page. I know disability and employment. Diana knows SLU and employment. We'll help you out together. Use every resource you have in front of you, and everyone you know should know that you're looking for a job. You want all eyes out there looking, all ears to the ground, keeping you in mind. Don't be cagey about that. It's too important.
But be prepared, if you're working with Jason and I, to get really tired of hearing about informational interviews. I know my career decision-making class is already sick and tired of hearing about them.
Well, look, I'll give you a real world example. My job at the Society for the Blind showed up out of the blue one day and said, hey, I'd be interested in volunteering. I'm a graduate with my MSW. I'm having a hard time getting a job. I think the best thing I could do would be volunteering. I get led into their social services manager and the director of the organization. Informational interview. It dawns on me, they're actually interviewing me at that point, and they say, hey, give us your resume. So I do. And I leave thinking, all right, it was a good informational interview. I'll wait and see if they have any volunteer opportunities for me. 6 months later, I'm already working. He calls me out of the blue and says, hey, we have an opening for a social worker and your resume was at the top of our pile. Will you come in for an interview? Yeah. So
Right.
I've had a bunch of jobs already, and there's only one of them that I got just by cold calling or submitting a resume. Everything else I've gotten through networking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The statistic is not a lie. I think it probably holds true for most people I know's, work lives. So, well, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your information with us. I really appreciate you doing this on such a last minute notice.
No problem.
Any last thoughts or any other last plugs that you want to put in before we close out?
If you're coming up, if you're going to be graduating this semester, our next capstone course, our 10-week course, is going to start in mid-February. We're going to be doing it virtually again. It's 6 hours a week, so 3 hours Tuesdays and Thursday mornings. I'm really going to strongly recommend. You might be thinking, Jason, I already know this stuff. Trust me, you don't. We bring in the experts. We bring in partner companies to talk about these things. So I've got people who are taking this who've got master's degrees for 30 years of work history saying, I never realized how important this was. So definitely give it a thought. If you can't do that, we're here for one-on-one consultation. It's completely free. You don't have to have a referral from VR or anything like that. If you're a current student, reach out for our Access U program. Katie Fields, who wasn't able to be here today, runs that. You're in wonderful hands with her. And yeah, tell your friends, let them know that we're here.
Absolutely. It's a great resource for the St. Louis area. So absolutely.
And we're national too. I've got people in other states too now. So
especially going virtual, I bet.
yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time. We'll go ahead and close out.
Thank you for having me.